The grand house of Leo's family was never a quiet place, but today the silence in his father's study was heavier and louder than any noise could ever be. Leo stood by the large window, his back to his parents, staring out at the gardens he had played in as a boy. They felt like a prison yard now. The words his father had just spoken still hung in the air, cold and final, like a judge passing a sentence. He was to be married. To a girl he had never met, from a family his father needed to do business with. It was not a question, not a discussion. It was an order. Leo's hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He felt a hot, sharp anger burning in his chest. This was his life, his future, and it was being traded away like a piece of property. He was not a son, he was a business deal. The days that followed were a blur of miserable activity. Tailors came to measure him for a suit he didn't want to wear. Cooks prepared elaborate foods for a feast he had no appetite for. The entire house was buzzing with excitement for a wedding that felt like a funeral to Leo. He tried to argue to find some way out, but his father's will was like a stone wall. "It is your duty," his father would say, his voice leaving no room for debate. "This union will secure our family's future. Your feelings are not important." Each time he heard those words, Leo felt a little piece of his hope die. He began to build a wall around his own heart, preparing for the life of quiet misery that awaited him. He imagined his bride to be, a girl named Maya, as being just like this situation, cold, forced and unloving. He decided then that he would despise her, because it was easier than admitting how helpless he felt. The morning of the wedding arrived, sunny and bright, which felt like a cruel joke to Leo. He put on the expensive, perfectly fitted suit and looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked handsome and serious, but his eyes were empty. He rode to the grand chapel in a silent car with his parents, the air so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. The chapel was filled with hundreds of people, all smiling and chatting, but Leo saw them as just a sea of blurry, unimportant faces. He took his place at the altar, his posture stiff, his jaw set. He felt like a soldier waiting for a battle he knew he would lose. Then the music began. The crowd stood, and all heads turned to watch the bride's procession. Leo stubbornly kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give the spectacle the satisfaction of his attention. He could see her from the corner of his eye, a shimmer of white fabric moving slowly down the aisle. He heard the soft whispers of the guests about how beautiful she looked, but he blocked it out. Beautiful, he thought bitterly, probably like a painted doll, with no thoughts or feelings of her own. When she finally stood beside him, he forced himself to turn and look at her properly for the first time. Maya was smaller than he had imagined. The veil covered most of her face, but he could see her delicate chin and the way her hands, holding a bouquet of flowers, trembled just slightly. He felt a flicker of something, pity perhaps, but he quickly smothered it with his anger. The priest began to speak, the familiar words of the ceremony washing over Leo without meaning. When it was time for him to say his vows, his voice was a flat, cold monotone. He promised to love and cherish her, but the words felt like lies on his tongue. He placed a ring on her finger, the metal cool against his skin. He barely listened as she said her own vows. Her voice was so quiet he almost couldn't hear it, a soft, shaky whisper. He assumed she was as unhappy as he was, and this only confirmed his belief that they were both victims in this stupid plan. The priest pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss the bride," he said. Leo's stomach tightened. He lifted Maya's veil and for a single brief second their eyes met. Hers were a deep, warm brown, and they were filled with a sadness that mirrored his own. But Leo was too wrapped up in his own resentment to see it. He leaned forward and gave her the quickest, most impersonal kiss possible, his lips barely brushing hers. It was over. The crowd cheered, but Leo felt nothing. He took Maya's arm and they walked back up the aisle together, a perfectly posed couple on the outside, but two complete strangers trapped in a cage made of promises they never wanted to make. The wedding party that followed was a long, painful affair. Leo avoided Maya, spending his time talking to guests about boring things he would never remember. He watched her from across the room, sitting quietly, barely touching her food. She seemed shy and withdrawn, and Leo took this as confirmation that she was boring and weak. He dreaded the moment the party would end, and they would be left alone together. He had no idea what he would say to her. He had no idea that the night ahead would hold the key that would unlock both of their prisons. The heavy door of the master suite clicked shut, and the last echo of well-meaning goodnights from the hallway faded into nothing. Leo stood frozen for a moment, his back against the cool wood of the door, as if it were the last barrier between himself and a fate he still desperately wished to avoid. The room was immense, opulently decorated for the occasion with flowers that now seemed to mock them with their cheerful brightness. A large fire crackled in the fireplace, casting long dancing shadows that made the silence feel even deeper and more profound. He could feel Maya's presence across the room, a small, still figure near the window, still holding her bouquet as if it were a shield. The air was so thick with unsaid words and unspoken dread that it was difficult to breathe. This was it. The moment he had been dreading since the announcement in his father's study. A whole lifetime stretched out before him, a sentence to be served in the company of a stranger. He pushed himself away from the door, his dress shoes sounding too loud on the polished floor. He walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames, feeling their heat but taking no warmth from it. He knew he had to say something, to lay down the rules of this miserable arrangement. It would be clear, he decided. He would tell her that they would live as polite roommates, that he expected nothing from her, and that she should expect nothing from him. It was the only way he could see to survive. He took a deep breath, steeling himself to turn around and deliver his cold speech. But as he pivoted, the words died in his throat. Maya had taken off her delicate veil, and in the flickering firelight, he could see her face clearly for the first time. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the flames, and in her eyes was not the coldness or the calculation he had expected, but a profound and weary sadness that seemed to reach into the very core of her being. It was a look that spoke of a surrender to a fate as unwanted as his own. She looked, he thought with a sudden, unexpected pang, just as lost as he felt. It was she who broke the silence. Her voice, when it came, was still soft, but it was no longer the shaky whisper from the altar. It was clear and steady, though laced with a deep exhaustion. "You don't have to stand so far away," she said, her eyes still on the fire. "And you don't have to pretend. I know you didn't want this. Any of this." Leo was so startled that he couldn't form a reply. This was not the opening he had prepared for. He had expected tears or silence, or perhaps even a matching coldness. He had not expected this quiet, direct acknowledgement of the elephant in the room. He found himself moving, almost without conscious thought, to sit in the large armchair opposite the sofa where she sat. The physical distance between them lessened, and with it, the tension in the air seemed to shift from hostile to simply heavy. "I'm sorry," she added after a moment, finally turning to look at him. "For all of it. For being a part of this transaction." The apology disarmed him completely. His carefully constructed wall of anger began to develop a hairline crack. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, and his own voice sounded less harsh than he intended. "It's not your fault our fathers treat people like chess pieces." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "No. But I am still the piece that was moved into your kingdom." The metaphor was so apt, so different from the simple, bitter thoughts he'd been having, that it sparked his curiosity. "Do you play chess?" he asked, the question surprising even himself. "I used to," she said, and for the first time, a hint of something other than sadness entered her voice, a flicker of memory perhaps of a happier time. "My grandfather taught me. He said it was a game of strategy, but also of seeing the person across from you. Of understanding what they might do next." And so they began to talk. It started slowly, cautiously, like two explorers testing thin ice. They talked about chess, about books, about their favorite places to escape to when the world felt too loud. Leo discovered that Maya was not shy or withdrawn out of weakness, but because she was thoughtful, observant. She listened, truly listened, to what he said, and her responses were intelligent and often surprisingly witty. He found himself telling her things he hadn't realized he'd wanted to say, about the pressure of being the only son, about his love for the quiet parts of the estate that his father considered useless, about his dream of building something for himself, not just inheriting what he was given. He learned that she loved the smell of rain on dry earth, that she secretly preferred stargazing to grand parties, and that she had a dog when she was little that she'd loved more than anything. With every shared detail, the image Leo had built of her, the boring, cold, money-hungry stranger, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place was a person. A real, complex, interesting person who was just as trapped as he was. The fire burned lower, the logs collapsing into embers, but neither of them noticed the passage of time. The room, which had felt like a prison cell hours before, now felt like a sanctuary, a secret bubble where the outside world and its demands could not reach them. At one point, Leo realized he was laughing, a real, genuine laugh that came from his belly, at a funny story Maya was telling about her grandfather's attempts to grow prize-winning roses. The sound echoed in the room, and it struck him that it was the first real laugh he'd had in weeks. He looked at Maya, really looked at her. The firelight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes and softened the lines of worry on her face. She was beautiful, not in the cold, perfect way he had imagined, but in a warm, real way that made his chest feel strangely tight. The anger was gone. The resentment had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. In its place was a bewildering, overwhelming sense of connection. This woman, this stranger he had been forced to marry, understood the loneliness he felt better than anyone ever had. They had been thrown into the deep end together, and instead of drowning each other, they had, without realizing it, begun to swim. The wedding had been a farce, a performance for their families. But this conversation, this quiet, unexpected meeting of minds in the dead of night, felt more real, more significant than any ceremony. The night was no longer something to be endured. It had become a beginning, and for the first time since his father had called him into the study, Leo felt a flicker of something that was not despair. It was a fragile, tentative, but very real feeling of hope. The comfortable silence that had settled between them was a living thing, warm and soft, a stark contrast to the icy dread that had filled the room hours before. They had exhausted light topics, and the conversation had drifted into a peaceful lull. Leo found he didn't want the night to end. He was comfortable, stretched out in his chair, watching the way the dying firelight played across Maya's features. The initial shock of her company had worn off, replaced by a deep, simmering curiosity. Who was this woman really? How could someone with such quiet intelligence and gentle humor be so resigned to a fate like theirs? It was this question that finally pushed him to voice the thought that had been circling in his mind. They must have pressured you too, he said, his voice low so as not to break the spell of the room. Your family. What did they say to make you agree to this? Maya, who had been tracing the pattern on the sofa's fabric with her finger, stilled. The small, contented smile that had been on her lips faded. She looked down at her hands, now folded in her lap, and a shadow seemed to pass over her face. The change was immediate and palpable. The ease that had grown between them tightened into something fragile. It wasn't about agreeing, Leo, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was about obeying. She took a slow, shaky breath, as if steeling herself for a painful confession. But they didn't just order me. They prepared me. They told me what to expect. Leo leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his full attention on her. What to expect from what? From the marriage? The business merger? From you, she said, and her eyes finally lifted to meet his. The sadness he had seen earlier was back, but now it was mixed with something else, shame. They painted a very specific picture of the man I was being sent to. They said it was my duty to be strong, to endure a difficult husband for the sake of our family's survival. A cold knot began to form in Leo's stomach. A difficult husband? He repeated, the words tasting sour. Maya nodded, her gaze dropping again, unable to hold his. They told me you were cold. That you had a terrible temper. That you were cruel. The last word was spoken so softly it was almost swallowed by the crackle of the embers. They said you would likely be harsh with me, that you would see me as a nuisance, a burden. They said I should make myself small and quiet to stay out of your way. That my only job was to be your wife in name and not cause any trouble. The air rushed from Leo's lungs as if he'd been struck. He felt a dizzying wave of disbelief, followed by a white-hot surge of anger, not at Maya, but at the monstrous caricature his future in-laws had created of him. All his life, he had struggled under the weight of his father's expectations, but he had always prided himself on his control, on his fundamental decency. To be described as cruel? It was a violation he had never anticipated. The pieces of the day began to snap into a new horrifying picture. Her trembling hands at the altar. Her downcast eyes. Her quietness, which he had mistaken for weakness or disinterest. It hadn't been any of those things. It had been fear. She had walked down the aisle believing she was marrying a monster. Maya, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Look at me. It took a moment, but she slowly raised her eyes. He saw the fear there, now clear as day, mixed with the shame of having confessed this terrible secret. I am not that man, he said, each word deliberate and firm. I was angry, yes. I resented this arrangement with every fiber of my being. I hated the loss of my freedom. I dreaded the thought of a life shackled to a stranger. But I could never be cruel to you. Or to anyone. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, but the doubt still lingered in her eyes. He needed her to understand the full scope of the manipulation. Don't you see? He continued, his voice rising with passion. They did to you exactly what my father did to me. He told me this marriage was a business necessity, that your family needed our money and were offering you up as part of the deal. He led me to believe you were a willing participant, that you were just as cold and calculating as the arrangement itself. He made me despise you before I'd even met you. The revelation hung in the air between them, vast and shocking. They had both been victims, but not just of a forced marriage. They had been victims of a deliberate campaign of lies, designed to make them distrust and dislike each other from the start. Their families hadn't just joined two houses. They had engineered a battlefield and sent two reluctant soldiers into it, each believing the other was the enemy. A single tear escaped from Maya's eye and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness now, but of overwhelming relief. They made us afraid of each other, she whispered, the truth dawning on her fully. Yes, Leo said, his own anger subsiding into a powerful, protective ache. He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the sofa, leaving a respectful space between them, but needing to be closer. They tried to break us before we even began. They wanted us to be miserable pawns. He watched as she processed this, as the weight of the fear she had carried for weeks began to lift from her. The way she looked at him changed. The last vestiges of caution melted away, replaced by a dawning wonder. She was seeing him for the first time, not as the cruel husband she'd been warned about, but as a fellow prisoner who had just helped her pick the lock on her cell. In the quiet that followed, a new understanding settled over them. The war was over before it had even properly begun, and the two supposed enemies had found a common cause. They were no longer Leo and Maya, the reluctant bride and groom. They were Leo and Maya, partners against the world that had tried to break them. The truth had not just been revealed, it had set them free, and in the space where fear and anger had lived, something new and tender began to cautiously take root. The confession had cleared the air like a thunderstorm, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with new possibilities. The lies that had hung between them, heavy and suffocating, were gone. In their place was a profound and startling intimacy, born from the shared understanding of their mutual betrayal. They were allies now, two souls cast adrift who had miraculously found each other in the same vast, lonely ocean. The dynamic in the room had shifted so fundamentally that the very space felt different. The Grand Master Suite was no longer a gilded cage but a neutral territory, a blank page on which they could write their own story. For a long while, they simply sat in the comforting silence, the only sound the soft hiss and pop of the dying fire. The physical space between them on the sofa, which had felt like a necessary barrier before, now felt like a pointless distance. Leo was intensely aware of Maya's presence beside him, the delicate shape of her hands resting in her lap, the subtle scent of her perfume, a faint hint of flowers. He looked at her, really looked, not as the symbol of his oppression but as Maya. He saw the gentle curve of her neck, the way a few strands of her dark hair had escaped its elegant style and curled softly against her skin. He saw the strength in the set of her shoulders, a strength that had allowed her to walk toward what she believed was a life of misery with her head held high. A powerful, warm feeling spread through his chest, a mixture of admiration, protectiveness, and a deep, growing attraction that was entirely his own, not forced upon him by anyone. He knew this was a crossroads. They could acknowledge their new alliance and retreat to separate corners of the room, beginning a polite, friendly, but perhaps distant partnership. Or they could choose something else. They could choose to see what might grow in the fertile ground of the truth they had just uncovered. Leo made his decision. It was the first real choice he had made about his marriage, and it was entirely for himself. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached out his hand. He didn't reach for her face or her shoulder, but for her hand, the one that bore the wedding ring he had placed there with such coldness hours before. His fingers gently brushed against hers, a tentative question. Maya's breath caught a tiny audible hitch. She looked down at their hands, then up into his eyes. He saw no fear there now, only a reflection of his own nervous hope, a shimmering uncertainty. Then she moved her hand, turning it so that her palm met his. Her fingers were cool and delicate, and as they laced tentatively with his, a jolt of pure, simple rightness shot up his arm. It was the first touch they had shared that was not for show, not part of a ceremony. It was just for them. This doesn't have to be the end, Leo said, his voice husky with emotion. This night. It can be a beginning. Our beginning. Maya's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She nodded, a small, decisive movement. I would like that, she whispered. I choose that. Those 3 words, I choose that, were more powerful than any wedding vow. They were a declaration of intent, a mutual agreement to step into the unknown together. Leo lifted his other hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away the single tear that had escaped. Her skin was incredibly soft. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief second, a silent surrender and an acceptance. The last of the invisible walls between them crumbled to dust. He leaned in slowly, giving her all the time in the world to refuse him. This kiss would be nothing like the cold, perfunctory brush of lips at the altar. This was a question, a promise, a new first. When their lips met, it was soft and searching. It was a kiss of discovery, of gentle exploration. It tasted of salted tears and sweet, overwhelming relief. Maya's free hand came up to rest on his chest, over his heart, which was beating a wild, joyful rhythm against his ribs. The kiss deepened naturally, fueled by the intense emotional intimacy of the night. It was no longer just a meeting of lips, it was a conversation, a sealing of the pact they had just made. The world outside, the scheming families, the business deals, the expectations, ceased to exist. There was only the quiet room, the warmth of the fire, and the astonishing reality of each other. What followed was a natural, unhurried unfolding of two people learning the map of each other for the first time. There was a shyness, a tender clumsiness that was more intimate than any practiced skill. It was a night of whispered questions and soft answers, of hesitant touches that grew bolder with shared confidence. It was not about passion alone, but about connection, about healing the wounds inflicted by others by offering the gentle balm of their own choosing. It was about transforming a contract signed under duress into a bond willingly forged in the quiet, private hours of the night. When they finally fell asleep, curled together in the center of the large bed, the first rays of dawn were painting the sky with light. The wedding day was over. But their marriage, their true marriage, had just begun. The dawn that broke was unlike any other in Leo's memory. It did not signal the start of another day of duty and resentment, but the beginning of an entirely new life. The first thing he was aware of was not the sunlight filtering through the curtains, but the weight and warmth of Maya nestled against his side, her head resting on his chest, her dark hair fanned out like silk across his skin. Her breathing was slow and even, a peaceful rhythm that synced with the steady beat of his own heart. He lay perfectly still, not wanting to disturb the profound tranquility of the moment, savoring the simple, miraculous reality of her presence. The room, which had felt so imposing and cold the night before, was now filled with a golden, quiet intimacy. The remnants of their wedding clothes were discarded on a chair, not as symbols of a forced ceremony, but as relics of a past that had ended just a few hours ago. In the clear light of morning there was no awkwardness, no regret. Instead there was a deep, settled contentment. As Maya began to stir, her eyes fluttered open and she looked up at him. There was no trace of the fear or sadness that had clouded them before. Instead, her gaze was clear, warm, and filled with a shy, undeniable love that made his breath catch. A soft smile touched her lips, a smile just for him, and in that moment, Leo knew with absolute certainty that he would spend the rest of his life earning that smile. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," he replied, his own voice thick with emotion. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch lingering. "It is a very good morning." The year that followed was a journey of discovery. They presented a united, polite front to their families, who smugly assumed their plan had worked to perfection. But in the privacy of their home, which they had made truly theirs, they built a world apart. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, how Leo needed absolute quiet with his first cup of coffee, how Maya hummed when she was concentrating in the garden they planted together. Their love was not a frantic, dramatic fire, but a steady, warming flame built on the solid foundation of the friendship forged that first night. It was in the way he'd bring her a book she'd mentioned wanting to read, or the way she'd have his favorite meal waiting after a difficult day dealing with his father's business. It was in the quiet conversations by the fireplace and the laughter that echoed through the halls of a house that had once felt so silent. Their intimacy deepened, growing from that first tender night into a language only they shared. It was a physical expression of the trust and partnership that defined them. It was never about obligation but about connection, a way of saying without words, "I am here. I choose you," again and again. The spicy heat of their passion was always wrapped in the profound safety of their mutual respect, a combination that made their bond unbreakable. On the evening of their first anniversary, Leo led Maya back to the master suite. He had recreated the scene from their wedding night, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the room lit only by soft, golden light. He took both of her hands in his, looking into the eyes of the woman who had become his best friend, his confidant, and the great love of his life. "A year ago, I stood in this room and thought my life was over," he began, his voice steady and full of emotion. I thought I was being sentenced to a lifetime of loneliness. But that night you were brave enough to speak the truth. You showed me that we weren't enemies but partners. That night, the night I truly met you, was the night my life actually began. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was not a new ring, but a delicate gold band designed to be worn alongside her wedding ring. "This ring is a promise," he said softly, slipping it onto her finger. "A promise that every day from now until forever I will choose you. Just as I did that night." Tears of joy streamed down Maya's face as she looked at the new ring, a symbol of a love they had built themselves. "I will always choose you too, Leo," she said, pulling him into a kiss that held all the love, promise and passion of their past and all the hope of their future. Their story had begun with a lie designed to tear them apart. But with courage and an open heart, they had written a different ending. A beginning, really. They had learned that the strongest love is not always the one you fall into, but sometimes the one you consciously, bravely build together, brick by brick, moment by moment, forever. If you were swept away by Leo and Maya's journey from reluctant strangers to soulmates, you know that the most beautiful stories are often found in the most unexpected places. Their tale of a love that conquered deception is just one of many. To discover more stories where a single night changes everything, where secrets unravel to reveal a forever kind of love, and where hearts find their true home against all odds, make sure to subscribe. A new world of romance, where every ending is a new beginning, is waiting for you just a click away.
I was running when I first saw him. Not gracefully, not like in movies. Stumbling, breath short, my palms slick with sweat and fear. The alley stretched like a throat closing around me, the sound of footsteps chasing my own. I'd taken the nanny job out of desperation, not bravery, but tonight that word, desperation, had teeth. It was chasing me. I crashed through the back door of the mansion, slamming it behind me, chest heaving. My vision swam. The hall was marble and silence, the kind of silence that made you hear your pulse. I didn't belong here. This house breathed money, power, and danger. It was his house. His name was Damien Cortez. Cold. Precise. Every story in the city whispered his name like a warning. I'd only seen him once, from a distance, during the interview. The way he looked at me then, measured, unreadable, made my voice falter. The agency said he needed someone for his son, a quiet little boy who'd stopped speaking after his mother died. They didn't say anything about the blood in his world. Now I could feel that world closing in. I turned a corner and froze. He was standing there. No sound announced him. No movement gave him away. Just that stillness, absolute and unnerving. A man carved out of dark calm. Black shirt open at the throat, sleeves rolled to his forearms. A vein beating lazily beneath his skin, as if the chaos outside didn't touch him. He looked at me like he'd been waiting. "Who's chasing you?" Not a question. A command. No one," I lied, voice breaking. His eyes dropped to my hands. The tremor gave me away. He stepped closer, the scent of smoke and leather and danger cutting through the air. I backed into the wall, the cold seeping through my spine. Try again. Something in me wanted to obey. Another part wanted to run. "I made a mistake," I whispered. His fingers brushed my wrist. A light touch. Still my body locked. His eyes lingered on my face, studying me the way men like him study weaknesses. "You don't belong in places like this," he said quietly. "But you already know that." I didn't answer. Couldn't. The hallway seemed to shrink around him. The heat of him pulled everything into focus. The slow drag of my breath, the way his voice settled low in my stomach. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. Behind him, the little boy appeared at the end of the corridor. Dark curls, wide eyes, clutching a stuffed bear like it was the last safe thing in the world. My heart lurched. "Eli," I breathed. The child blinked at me, then at Damien. Something fragile passed between them. A current I couldn't read. He turned back to me. "You scared him." His tone wasn't anger. It was observation, judgment. "I didn't mean, meaning is irrelevant," he cut in. "Control is what matters." He walked past me toward Eli, kneeling down to the boy's level. His voice softened barely. "Go back to bed." The child hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the shadows. The house swallowed him. When Damien straightened, he looked different. Not softer, just quieter, like something dangerous had gone still beneath the surface. "You took this job because you needed money," he said. "But you didn't ask whose money it was." I wanted to speak, to explain that I didn't have choices left. My rent, my mother's medical bills, the endless crawl of survival. I was just trying to stay above water. But none of that sounded like enough. "Do you always interrogate your employees like this?" I asked, trying for brave. His mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something sharper. "Only the ones who lie." He stepped closer again, so close I could feel his breath near my ear. "Next time someone chases you, you come to me before you run into my house covered in fear. Do you understand?" The word "my" wasn't about the house. It was about everything it contained. I nodded, unable to speak. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes. "Good." He turned to leave, and for a moment I thought it was over. But something in me, something reckless, made me whisper, "Why did you hire me?" He stopped. The pause felt like a blade hanging in the air. Finally he said, "Because my son called you safe." I didn't know how to respond. Safe. I hadn't been called that before. He left without another word. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the small guest room, the hum of the mansion filling the dark. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of the floor, the whisper of the wind against the windows. I could feel his presence even through walls, like the house itself bent around him. I thought about his eyes, the way they saw straight through me. About Eli, silent and small, staring up at a father who didn't know how to reach him. About the moment Damien touched my wrist, how it wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either. It was testing. The next morning, I met Eli in the garden. He was drawing in the dirt with a stick. When I sat beside him, he didn't look up. I waited. Silence hung between us until finally, he whispered, "You were scared last night." His voice startled me. He hadn't spoken before, not to anyone. "Yeah," I said softly. "A little." "You don't have to be," he said. "He doesn't hurt good people." "Is that what you think I am?" He shrugged. "He said you were safe." The words hit harder the second time. Safe. The irony burned. When Damien appeared at the edge of the garden, dressed in black again, watching us with that still, unreadable gaze, Eli's hand found mine. Instinct, not trust. I met Damien's eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. But something passed through the air, possession maybe, or warning. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I felt it again. That awareness. I didn't need to turn to know he was there. "You don't lock your doors," he said behind me. I jumped, almost dropping the plate. "I didn't think—" "That's the problem," he said. "You don't think, you feel, and feelings get people killed." His voice was quiet, but the weight of it pressed down on me. I turned to face him. "You can fire me if I'm a problem." He stepped closer. "If you were a problem, you wouldn't still be here." His eyes caught the light, gray, sharp, and unreadable. I felt my chest tighten. "What are you afraid of?" he asked. The question slipped under my skin. I wanted to lie. Instead, I whispered, "You." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that. "Good." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. My breath caught. His hand hovered there, not quite touching, like he was studying the effect of his nearness. "Fear keeps people honest," he said. "But don't confuse it with safety." Then he walked away, leaving the air fractured behind him. That night I dreamt of him, his eyes, his voice, the slow, measured way he moved. I woke before dawn, pulse racing, half expecting to find him standing in the doorway. Instead, I found a note on the nightstand, in clean, deliberate handwriting, breakfast at 7. Don't make him wait. There was no signature. He didn't need one. When I entered the dining room, the world felt suspended. He was already seated at the end of the long table, coffee in hand, reading a file. The morning light caught the edge of his jaw, the unbuttoned collar of his shirt. He looked up. "Sit," I obeyed. Eli sat beside him, quiet, watching both of us like he could feel the static in the air. Damien closed the file. "You're staying," he said simply. I blinked. "What?" He leaned back. "You think I didn't see the people following you last night? You brought danger to my door. That makes you my responsibility now. I don't want to be your—" He interrupted with a small, sharp laugh. "You don't get to want. Not here." I stared at him, fury and fear colliding. "You can't just decide that." He leaned forward, voice dropping. "I can, and I have. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Then he said it, quiet, certain, final. "You'll remember me." The words sank into me like a mark I couldn't wash off. I tried to leave 3 times. Each attempt ended before it began. The first, the car wouldn't start. The second, the gate code didn't work. The third, one of his men was waiting in the driveway, silent, unreadable, saying only, "Mr. Cortez said you'd need help unpacking." That was the moment I understood. There was no leaving. Not until he decided I could. The mansion became a kind of cage, beautiful, vast, and inescapable. I told myself I was here for Eli. The boy had started speaking again, in fragments, whispers. He'd draw pictures of people with no faces, then hand them to me without explanation. I'd nod like I understood. But the truth was, I was unraveling, because Damien was everywhere. I'd feel him before I saw him. The shift in air pressure, the silence that followed his steps. He'd watch me sometimes from the doorway, saying nothing, just standing there, arms folded, like he was cataloging the shape of my fear, and I hated that part of me leaned toward it. One night, Eli had a nightmare. I rushed to his room, holding him until he calmed, whispering lullabies I barely remembered. When I looked up, Damien was in the doorway again, his eyes dark, unreadable. He said nothing. But when I rose to leave, he said quietly, "Stay." I froze. "He's asleep." His gaze didn't waver. I wasn't talking about him. Something in his tone pinned me. I followed him downstairs, each step measured, deliberate. The living room was dim, firelight flickering over glass and steel. He poured whiskey, the motion unhurried. "You think I'm a monster?" he said. "I think you like people to think that." A small, humorless smile. "It helps." He handed me a glass. I didn't take it. He studied me over the rim of his drink. "Fear looks good on you," he said softly. "It's honest." "Maybe you mistake fear for respect," I said. "Maybe you mistake survival for rebellion." His words hit low. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He'd built a world where silence did the work. He walked closer, the scent of whiskey and smoke wrapping around me. I could feel the heat of him even before he touched me. "I should go to bed," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "Should," he echoed, "but you won't." His fingers brushed the side of my throat, tracing the flutter of my pulse. "Your body always tells the truth before you do." I hated that he was right. I hated the shiver that followed his touch. He leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what you're afraid of now." "You," I breathed. His lips curved. "Still?" "Yes." He studied me for a moment that felt endless. Then, as if granting mercy, he stepped back. The air between us snapped. "Go," he said. I ran before he could change his mind. But even after I shut the door behind me, I could still feel him. The echo of his presence settled in my chest, heavy and electric. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time blurred inside those walls. Eli started smiling again, laughing quietly when I'd chase him through the garden. For a while, that laughter was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. But the house had rules. Unspoken, rigid. Certain doors stayed locked. Certain questions were never asked. I learned to read the rhythms of his world, the meetings in the East Wing, the men in black who came and left at strange hours, the phone calls that ended with silence and clenched jaws. Then one afternoon I overheard my name. It was in his office. The door wasn't fully closed. A man's voice said, "She's a liability, Damien. You don't know who she talked to." "She didn't talk to anyone," Damien replied, calm but sharp. "How do you know that?" "Because she's still alive." The chill that crawled down my spine was instant. I moved before they could notice me, heart pounding. A liability. Still alive. The words clung to me like fingerprints. That night, he came to my room. No knock, no warning. Just the door opening and him standing there, dark eyes catching the low light. "Did you hear me earlier?" I shook my head, but I wasn't convincing. He stepped forward. "Don't lie to me." My throat tightened. "What happens if I do?" He tilted his head, studying me. "You don't want to find out." The air between us pulsed. I hated how my pulse matched it. "Then tell me," I said quietly. What am I to you? His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze. Conflict, maybe. Or recognition. You're an inconvenience I can't seem to remove, he said. It should have hurt. Instead, it felt like honesty. He took another step, closing the space until I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. But don't mistake that for weakness. I don't, I whispered. Good. His hand lifted, fingers threading through my hair. Because I don't do mercy. And I don't do love. Then what is this? He paused. Control. I should have pushed him away. Instead, I stayed. His touch burned. Not cruelly, but with intention, testing boundaries I didn't know I had. He didn't kiss me, not yet. It was worse than that. He looked at me like he already owned the space inside my chest. When he finally left, the air felt hollow. I sat there, shaking, trying to understand what he'd done to me. It wasn't attraction. It was gravity. And I was already caught. The next morning, Eli ran to me in the hallway, clutching something small in his hand. He said to give you this, the boy said. It was a silver key. No note, just the key. I turned it in my fingers, feeling the weight. Did he say what it's for? Eli shook his head. He said you'd figure it out. That night, curiosity beat fear. I walked the halls until I found the door that fit. The lock clicked, soft and final. The room inside was different from the rest of the mansion. Smaller, colder, lined with metal cabinets and files. On the desk, a single photograph lay face down. When I turned it over, my breath caught. It was me, standing outside the hospital from months ago, before I ever met him. The date was printed at the bottom. He'd known me before I arrived. Before the interview, before I even applied, I dropped the photo, heart slamming, footsteps behind me. You weren't supposed to see that, his voice said. I turned. He was in the doorway, eyes unreadable, but his calm was different now, cracked. You knew me, I said. He didn't answer. How long? Long enough to know you'd say yes, he said quietly. The words hit like a blow. You set this up, he walked forward. I needed someone I could trust with my son. So you spied on me? I protected you, I laughed bitterly. You don't know the difference. He stopped inches from me, jaw tight. You're right, I don't. Because every time I think about letting you go, I remember what happens to things I don't control. I stared at him, trembling with anger and something worse. Want. You can't keep me here, I said. He reached out, fingers brushing my chin, forcing me to meet his eyes. I already am. I slapped his hand away. You think this is power? It's fear. He smiled, small and dangerous. Fear is power. The tension broke like glass. I shoved past him, storming down the corridor. His voice followed. Low. Final. Run if you want, but understand this. Every door you open still leads back to me. I didn't stop until I reached my room, locking the door behind me. My pulse wouldn't slow. I pressed my back against the wood, trying to breathe. He'd known me, chosen me. Controlled everything from the start. But beneath the fury, beneath the betrayal, there was another truth I couldn't deny. Part of me didn't want to leave. That was the worst part. At dawn, I woke to shouting. Men in the hall. Footsteps, hurried and harsh. I grabbed a robe and opened the door. Damien was there, gun in hand, eyes cold. Get Eli, he ordered. What's happening? He didn't look at me. They found us. Who? Now. I ran to Eli's room, heart racing, gathering him into my arms. His small hands clung to my neck. Behind me, the sound of glass shattering. Damien's voice, low and lethal, barking orders. When I turned, he was there again. Face streaked with shadow and fury. Stay behind me, he said. And then, over the noise, he glanced at me, just once. The look was raw, unguarded, something I'd never seen before. It lasted a heartbeat. Then the gunfire started. The sound still lives inside me. The gunshot, the glass exploding into light, the way time stretched before impact. He moved first. I didn't see it, I felt it. Damien's body colliding with mine, the weight, the heat, the breath leaving my lungs as he pushed me to the floor. Then silence, thick and pulsing. I opened my eyes. His blood was on my hands. "Stay down," he rasped, dragging himself up. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, but the look in his eyes made it clear. He wasn't done. He turned, gun raised, firing once, twice, the hallway filled with noise and smoke. When it was over, the air smelled like iron and endings. Eli was crying. I crawled to him, clutching him to my chest. My hands shook. My voice wouldn't come. Damien was already on his feet, bleeding but steady. He looked at us like he was memorizing the scene. Then his tone dropped, low and final. "We're leaving." We drove in silence. The world outside blurred into night and motion. His men followed in black cars, headlights cutting through the dark. I held Eli against me, whispering his name over and over, like it was a spell to keep him safe. When we finally stopped, it was at a safe house by the coast. Empty, quiet, surrounded by fog and salt air. I put Eli to bed, brushing hair from his forehead, pretending my hands weren't trembling. When I stepped back into the living room, Damien was standing at the window, shirt half unbuttoned, blood seeping through the bandage on his shoulder. His reflection in the glass looked almost human. "You should let me clean that," I said softly. He didn't turn. "I've had worse." "I haven't." That made him look at me. The sharpness in his eyes softened, barely. I moved closer, wordless, and reached for the bandage. He didn't stop me. The wound wasn't deep, but the sight of it made something in my chest twist. "You could have died," I said. "Would that matter to you?" I hesitated. "You know it would." His jaw tightened. "That's exactly the problem." He turned away, but I caught his wrist. "You think everything's a transaction. It's not." He laughed quietly, no warmth in it. "In my world, everything is." "Then maybe that's why your son stopped speaking." The silence that followed was thick. His hand closed around my wrist. Not hard, but enough to make me feel it. "Careful," he said softly. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I whispered. He studied me for a long moment, the air between us sharp with something unnamed. Then slower this time he let go. "You should be," he said. But his voice didn't match the words. That night I couldn't sleep. The ocean beat against the cliffs outside. Somewhere down the hall a door opened. I didn't move until I felt him in the doorway. "You're not resting," he said. "Neither are you." He came closer, stopping beside the bed. The moonlight caught his face, tired, shadowed, almost vulnerable. "Why did they come after us?" I asked. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees. "Because I kept something that wasn't mine." "What?" He looked at me. "You." The words hit like a storm. I couldn't breathe. "What are you talking about?" "I made a deal," he said. "Months ago, before you worked for me." My pulse quickened. "A deal?" He nodded once. "They wanted leverage. I gave them a name. Yours." My chest went cold. "You sold me. I protected you. By giving me away?" He met my stare. "I gave them your name so they'd stop asking for others. I didn't know they'd come for you." "You used me," I said, voice breaking. He didn't deny it. "Why?" He looked at the floor. "Because I wanted to see if something in this world could stay uncorrupted." "Then you found out it couldn't," I whispered. He looked up. "No, I found out it could ruin me." The room felt too small for the truth. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was watch him. This man who built his life on control, now looking like it had slipped through his hands. "Tell me why you really hired me," I said. He hesitated. "Because you reminded me of the woman who saved me once." My throat tightened. "Eli's mother?" He nodded slowly. "She believed I could be better. She was wrong. And me? You made me want to try again." Something inside me broke. Not from pain, something deeper. I reached out, fingertips grazing the edge of his jaw. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. Just watched me, as if waiting for permission to feel. "I don't forgive you," I said. "I don't want forgiveness." "Then what do you want?" He leaned closer, voice raw. "To forget what I've done when I look at you." And then he kissed me. Not gentle, not cruel, just real. Two people too far gone to pretend anymore. My hands found his face, his hair, his skin still warm from the fight. It wasn't peace, it was surrender. When it ended, he stayed close, forehead resting against mine. You should hate me. I do, I whispered. But it doesn't change what I feel. He closed his eyes. That's what scares me. By morning, he was gone. The safe house was empty except for me and Eli. His men had vanished. The world felt hollow again. On the table lay another note, written in the same sharp handwriting. If they come, take him to the docks. Don't wait for me. I burned it. Hours passed before I heard the engines. Cars, distant but closing. I grabbed Eli, running down the back stairs, out through the rain-soaked sand. But the voice that stopped me wasn't theirs. Stop, I turned. Damien stood at the edge of the cliff, gun in hand, clothes torn, eyes wild. You're hurt, I said. He shook his head. It's over. What did you do? He gave a faint, broken smile. What I always do. I ended it. I didn't understand until I saw the blood on his other hand. His knuckles were raw, his eyes distant. They won't stop, I said. They will, he murmured, because I gave them everything left to take. I stepped closer, Eli clinging to me. You don't have to do this. His gaze shifted to the boy, then back to me. He's safe now, because of you. Damien. He reached out, brushing his thumb against my cheek. You were right. Fear isn't power. It's chains, and I'm tired of wearing them. The wind whipped around us. The ocean roared below. He took a step back, eyes locked on mine. Take care of him. I lunged forward. Don't you dare. But before I could finish, he whispered, You'll remember me. And then he was gone. The weeks after blurred into a haze of silence and grief. The authorities called it a disappearance. His men scattered. The mansion was sealed. But some nights, when Eli wakes crying, I still hear Damien's voice in my head. Low, rough, unrelenting. I tell the boy stories now. About a man who taught me that safety and control aren't the same. About a house filled with ghosts. About how love can destroy and still feel like truth. Sometimes I wonder if he planned it all. To break me open. To make me see the parts of myself I'd buried. He didn't save me. He unmade me. And in the ruin, I learned who I was. If this story gripped you, listen to the full audiobook version on our channel for more dark mafia love confessions that blur the line between danger and desire. Subscribe and stay for the next story.